right, so welcome to a Tennessee Court Talk podcast on public confidence and trust in the courts, and I'm very excited to be doing this in conjunction with the Conference of Chief Justices here in Nashville, the mid-year meeting, and I have got three terrific guests to talk about this topic. We're welcoming Chief Justice Loretta Rush from Indiana, Chief Judge Anna Blackburne-Rigsby from the District of Columbia, and Chief Justice Beth Walker from West Virginia. Welcome, ladies.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Well,
it's great to be here.
So, public confidence and trust. The National Center for State Courts does a survey of public trust and confidence, and frankly, over the last 10 years or so, the news has not been good for the courts. The public trust and confidence numbers have been declining. But most recently this year, we did not have a decline. It held steady. Justice Walker, I know that you have participated in a podcast called Lady Justice with two other justices of state Supreme Courts. And you looked at the numbers last year. Have you had a chance to look at the most current report from the National Center for State Courts to see how those compare?
Absolutely. And it's so great that you were talking about this topic. As Chief Justice Rush said, you know, this is the foundation on which we build the judiciary in all of the states. And when, you know, what we learned in West Virginia a few years ago is that when you lose that public trust and confidence, it takes serious work to get it back, and it really is a crisis, which is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it, one of the reasons I'm involved in these conversations and following closely the work of the National Center as they monitor and have for a decade or so the sort of public score for the state courts. And as you mentioned, state courts had been receiving more favorable marks, so to speak, in polls that the National Center has done consistently for about a decade until very recently, not this year, but the year before. And it slipped a little, and it slipped enough to start talking about it more urgently and trying to figure out exactly what is it, an overall lack of satisfaction with the courts? Is it the courts themselves, or is it government altogether? Is it our divisive conversations on social media and in the news? And exactly what is at the heart of it. So I'm really have appreciated watching what the National Center does and watching now things starting to shift just a little bit away from the negative direction, I guess. I think the fair, and I'll let Chief Judge Blackburne-Rigsby talk more about it because she hosted a webinar on this topic last week, but at least it's not going in a negative direction anymore.
Yeah, and Judge Blackburne-Rigsby, you're not only the current president of the Conference of Chief Judges, but you also chaired a committee on public engagement, trust, and confidence. Can you tell me a little bit about what the impetus was that? Was that because of declining poll numbers that committee was formed?
Yes, in large part. And this is an issue, as you've heard from my colleagues, Chief Justice Rush and Chief Justice Walker, is very near and dear to my heart. And it's something we care deeply about. The Public Trust and Confidence Committee, and it's called the Community Engagement Public Trust and Confidence Committee for the Conference of Chief Justices and Court Administrators, was founded a few years ago because we were seeing a decline in public trust. And there were lots of things happening. A resurgence of some racial unrest in our communities in the aftermath of the tragic death of George Floyd. As Chief Justice Walker said, the general dissatisfaction with government overall. But we were proud that people generally viewed the courts more favorably than other branches of government. What we realized, though, is we had to really work harder. It wasn't enough to sit back and occasionally do some outreach and say, to know us is to love us. What we had to do is really figure out ways for authentic and ongoing engagement with the communities that we serve. And the difference between engagement is it's a two-way conversation. It means we have to listen to what the people that we serve need from our courts, and then we have to do something about it when we get their thoughts and their ideas to show that we respect them, we're listening, and look, we've tried to implement some of the ideas that you suggested to make our courts work better and fairer. And I have to tell you, sometimes it's hard to listen. We don't always like what we hear, but, you know, I think if you talk to any of our colleagues, we really try to do right, and we try to be fair and impartial and welcoming to all, but we fall short sometimes. And sometimes what we think will work from the inside looking out is not what actually works for the people on the outside looking in. And we have to humble ourselves to be able to hear what the people need from their judicial branch and from the courts. And, most people who ever go into any court go into their local state courts in their neighborhoods. And we forget that sometimes when we're talking about this on a larger scale. So as president of the Conference of Chief Justices this year, this is a topic I've chosen to focus on. And there's so much work that we're doing in our courts. When we share information and hear from people, any issue that they're facing, substance abuse, mental health, behavioral health, crime in their neighborhood, eviction, and housing issues, all of those issues are in our courts. And we are looking for ways to help be a part of the solution when we are administering justice in our courts.
Yeah, Chief Justice Blackburn, you mentioned how state courts are really where most people interact with the court system. And I'm wondering about how the news and the media treatment of, say, the United States Supreme Court and the press that they get might influence our numbers. Justice Rush, any thoughts about, do you feel like that there is some carryover on the way the public thinks about the federal system and state courts, and we sometimes get lumped in together with them? Do you think the average person really distinguishes between the two court systems?
They don't. It's you guys. So I think what 98% of the cases enter in the state courts is Judge Anna Blackburne-Rigsby is saying we're sort of the government emergency rooms. We have the issues that are probably closest to the people when you look at like housings and guardianships and opioid epidemic. So we have to earn that trust. So when you look at the number of cases we have and the people that come before us, you've got to treat them fairly. So part of public trust and confidence, we've got to earn with how we treat the litigants. And then we've got to learn what's working, what's not working. The idea of us sitting up on a bench and dispensing justice all day isn't just going to get it done. You've got to get out in your communities. You've got to convene different endeavors. Here's an example of something we did. Coming out of COVID, what should be the role of remote court? Did people feel like they were getting justice having their remote court? So we worked with Indiana University, private researchers, and we had them do an extensive study. And it's the same kind of study that the National Center does in looking at public trust. And I went in there thinking people want to come to court. They didn't. It was like loudly and resoundingly. It was a pretty wide study. They didn't want to get childcare, get transportation, miss work. So we've got to lean into other things, and we've got to look and pull some data on what's working for them. You think about walking in a courthouse. How do you navigate that? So I think working with different I call them justice partners on what's working, talking to your public defenders, talking to your prosecutors, talking to your civil legal aid, and changing and morphing the court system to make it, I say, more customer-friendly. They're customers. So you got to treat them like that when they come in. How do you make it more accessible? How do you have an online portal that people can answer? We've got kiosks that are in libraries, and we're putting them in things like Dollar Generals and rural communities so you can have simple answers and going through. Because these needs that come before us, that's their biggest thing. The hold up to them maybe having a quality of life is dependent on how they can access. And when you look at the number of people living in poverty that have unmet civil legal aid needs, we can't just sit back and say, hey, come find us. We've got to really make sure that we're morphing and changing and evolving. And the changes we've had in the judiciary in the last 4 years have been more than I've seen in the last 40 that have been a lawyer and a judge. So it's an exciting time. Listening to the different groups, people that feel like there's a two-tiered system of justice. Why? Okay, that's not okay that you think justice is for this group. Then you've got to start doing the real work to say, why is it? And what needs to be changed? And it's those listening tours. It's our judges getting out in the communities and really finding out what is the best way to dispense justice. Because that's a big word, justice.
Chief Justice Walker, Chief Justice Rush's comments reminded me of something you said that West Virginia was trying out with their new Intermediate Court of Appeals, where they were having remote proceedings for parties to participate to get past the issues about Wi-Fi connectivity and that sort of thing. Could you talk a little bit about what you're doing in West Virginia?
Sure, that's great. So until just last year, West Virginia's court system were just two levels, trial and then the Supreme Court. And our legislature created an intermediate court for the first time. So that is something new. We were one of only about 10 or 11 states that didn't have an intermediate court. And this was being created in the midst of the pandemic, and people were starting to think differently. And so we had already experimented so much with remote proceedings, we thought, well, like many rural states, we have a lot of counties where there's no internet, as you say, or very little internet, or very poor internet. And we learned, even as we had remote proceedings, that some lawyers could not get to, even lawyers could not get to a place where there was stable enough internet to do an oral argument. So we thought when we were creating the intermediate court, we would set up remote locations that were wired, locations, didn't have to rely on Zoom. That Zoom is great, but that were actually wired in, and we picked them in 5 different locations around the state. So no litigant would have to travel more than an hour and a half or so in order to appear before the Intermediate Court of Appeals. And they are committed rooms in courthouses around our state. They aren't like a conference room that is used for somebody's birthday party sometimes, or sometimes for the Intermediate Court. It's always the Intermediate Court of Appeals. And we have been thrilled with the reception. When the Intermediate Court was created, one of its jurisdictional areas is domestic cases. And we know that many domestic litigants are self-represented and wouldn't have to necessarily travel to Charleston, West Virginia from 5 hours away in order to argue their case. So that really led to us being creative. It was one of the silver linings of the pandemic that we probably would have never thought of doing that had it not been for the remote proceedings that we'd already done. And it's been very well received.
That sounds like an excellent idea. Tennessee is a skinny state, but it's a long state. And so it's a long way from Bristol or Johnson City to Memphis. That sounds like a brilliant way of approaching that.
Can I pick up on
Oh, yeah, please do.
2 things that my dear colleagues and friends, that's one of the great things of organizations like our conference, is you get to meet your colleagues who do the same thing you do in different states and different parts of the country. The District of Columbia is a very small geographic area, and it's an all-urban jurisdiction. And despite, it being less than 11, 12 miles from one end of the District of Columbia to the other, it's like crossing a divide in terms of poverty levels. We have, on the one hand, the third largest bar in the country, meaning the third largest number of attorneys licensed to practice in the District of Columbia. Yet we have one of the highest rates of poverty in certain parts of the District of Columbia. So you would think, what is it to get from 11 miles away if you're talking about a state like Tennessee? But it takes sometimes several buses, metro transportation, plus childcare, plus parking, plus time away from your job. And one of the things that we've done is created pop-up courtrooms in different parts of the district and all of the quadrants of the city in public buildings. And this is really important for reliable Wi-Fi. And again, we're talking about an urban jurisdiction that you think has all of these amenities. It doesn't for everyone. But it also provides a safe location. If you're a victim of domestic violence, even if you have Wi-Fi in your home, you can't have that hearing there. But if you go to one of these locations, it's safe, there's security, there's reliable Wi-Fi. So, we did an eviction diversion task force and program. During COVID, many people were at risk of being evicted with nowhere to go at the worst part of the COVID pandemic. And so, like many places, we put a halt temporarily on evictions. Now we're looking at creative ways to work out some payment plans where the landlords can get something, the tenants can keep their home, because it's not like they lose this home and they just move to another home. In the District of Columbia, for those living in poverty, it's about 25% of the population. It's really shocking to some people. If you lose your home, this apartment, then you're homeless. And we also have an unfortunately high rate of homelessness in the District of Columbia. So when something doesn't happen in your case and justice is not accessible to you, and you're on the margins, living on the margins, either because of language problems, unemployment, lack of housing, poverty, any one of the cases that we see can set your life in a spiral. And we can no longer afford as judges and courts to have this siloed mentality. I have this one case. I'm just going to sit back like a referee. And we have to see take a more holistic approach while still following the law and the facts, but with a better understanding of who are the people and the businesses and the parties that come before us. And that's been a sea change, especially as Chief Justice Rush said in the last 4 years, and Chief Justice Walker said, this is a time of exciting innovation. Because let's face it, I think the courts have not always been known to be change agents in society. In fact, we're guided by precedent, what already happened. So we've realized that we've got to roll up our sleeves and work to earn the trust of the people that we serve.
That brings me to my next question then. You each are leaders of your judiciary and your respective jurisdictions. And you've talked about innovation and change, a lot of it wrought by the pandemic. But the judiciary is slow to change also. Some of that is good. I mean, some of that, it keeps us from moving off precipitously into some direction where we shouldn't be moving off into. But I know even during the pandemic, as we were going to virtual proceedings, that there were resistance. We can't do it this way. How do you address the resistance that comes from this sort of change? I mean, how do you tackle that?
Well, it's always there. I mean, when you look at, we're now paperless in Indiana. We have 83 million page views, but you can go on our courts are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on that. People say, I need my paper. I can't possibly read. I remember a former Chief Justice and I said we're going paperless as a court. It was just mountains of paper. And he goes, I can't possibly do it. Now he loves it. I said, so you're Exhibit A. But I think how you do change is you bring a lot of people in. Instead of the courts just setting edicts on high, you talk to legal service providers, you talk to like medical legal partnerships where we are embedding lawyers in medical facilities. And it kind of goes back to public trust and confidence, because these are the type of innovations that cause us to better deliver the services to the people that need them in court. We send millions of text message reminders. Our default rates are way down now. If you get defaulted, you go to jail. So the changes in getting our judges to change, too. Well, I don't really want to get involved in these messy substance use disorder, mental health. Well, the primary referral source, other than self, to get people to treatment right now, do you know what it is?
It's courts.
It's the criminal justice system. So we need to understand what is effective, evidence-based substance use disorder treatment. How do you treat a mother while she's trying to go through treatment? Can she keep her child? And the child welfare cases with the opioid epidemic, guardianships with them have exploded. How do you deal with our aging populations? We're seeing more and more elder abuse coming to our courts. So, what do you do? I have CASAs, or court-appointed special advocates for children. I have VASIAs, which are court-appointed special advocates for endangered adults. So you sort of look at the trends and you see when they're coming in, 70% of people in our jails right now have a mental health, substance abuse, or co-occurring disorder. They've become the de facto mental health treatment. So as judges, I always say we have a couple of superpowers, and one is convening. And when you call people a meeting, they tend to show up. So what do we deal with the mental health? How do you work with your sheriffs that are dealing with some seriously mental health people that are just sitting in jail? They're waiting for maybe a competency evaluation. And those are the cases that touch on the people. So if we look at how we treat people, and so many millions of people come into court a year in the state courts, how important that procedural fairness is. Have that interpreter there, even signing how you go into a courthouse. You've been in courthouses, right? Even as an attorney going into a courthouse, I don't even know where to go. But can you imagine somebody with a court case? So I think change is hard, but we have, my whole judiciary has changed over. I don't know how it's in Tennessee. Probably a third of my judges have been judges less than 3 or 4 years. So I feel like we have this new blood of people that want to have problem-solving courts, people that say, I just can't see on a day and see the carnage that comes before me without saying, what can I do to be part of the solution? How can you reach back up to something called the sequential intercept model? Where do these problems hit in your community? And what levers can we as judges pull to make it better?
It's amazing how young judges have seemed to become lately. They seem to get younger and younger every year. And
it doesn't have anything to do with us getting old.
No, strangely. Justice Walker, how do you overcome resistance to change?
Well, I think playing off of Chief Justice Rush is really good at explaining how state courts, how our trial courts in West Virginia and probably every state and the district are really the emergency rooms of society. You know, we spend, for example, in West Virginia, our Supreme Court, you know, the highest court in the land, 40% of our caseload is child abuse and neglect cases. We have a huge crisis still coming off the opioid epidemic, right? And so in coming back around to your question, our judges are facing terrible domestic situations day in, day out. They come across as child abuse and neglect cases, criminal cases, all of it. And they want to help the folks that come before them. They want to treat them fairly and impartially according to the rule of law, of course. But you know, day in, day out, they see this just human misery sometimes. And I have found that when they see it as an opportunity to be problem solvers, as Loretta was saying, you know, coming up with solutions, maybe helping as opposed to just adjudicating. Of course, adjudicating is always the primary job. But if you can cast things as an opportunity or a way to make life better for everyone in their community, I find all judges want that result. All judges want the public to have confidence in what they're doing and for them to be able to go home at the end of the day as a judge and be content that they've done something to help the folks in their community in the way that public servants are. I mean, that's why, you know, you and others, that's why we're judges, because we're looking to serve the public. You know, we heard about the Tennessee Justice Bus this morning in another conversation where, again, innovating. But, you know, you were taking remote assistance for folks who need legal assistance all across your long, thin state of Tennessee, all 3 grand divisions. And that's, I'm sure maybe people wondered, but now everyone probably wants to say that it was their idea to do it.
Our Constitution has a clause in it that says justice should be based on principles of reformation and not vindication or being vindictive. So, I mean, part of we order services all the time, right? So part of this helping people is part of our constitutional responsibility of reformative justice.
And one of the things I think we're learning, many of these innovations we've talked about and thought about, and we've done a lot, even prior to the pandemic. The pandemic was sort of a crisis that served as an accelerant to many things. I remember talking about remote hearings before the pandemic and thinking to myself, how could you do a remote hearing that's not in court? And now it's a part of who we are. We live stream our Court of Appeals arguments and people's appeals, and we're streamed on YouTube. And if you'd ever told me I'd be a YouTube phenomenon, my son thinks that's hilarious, but people actually watch and they can see. And we're actually reaching more people and making our process and our courts open and more transparent. And I think one of the things we struggle with the innovations, and I think you touched on it, we don't want to be the court that shifts with the sand and with the storm, any new gimmick we're going to try. And so people are uncertain. But we need to balance the stability of the law and the constancy of the law and the notion that the law is fair to all, just like the words above the United States Supreme Court, equal justice for all. Our court's motto is open to all, justice for all, and fairness for all. And we have to balance the stability and constancy of the law with the ability to be innovative and to adapt to serve the needs of the community. 2 other examples of innovations that we never thought we'd be doing is we have ads on our metro buses about the eviction diversion court, where if you're a landlord or you're a tenant and you need help, and, you know, we have a lot of metro buses. We're an urban area. We never thought the courts would be on the side of a bus with a positive message anyway.
Is there a picture of you on the side of the bus?
No, that one I don't think it's coming anytime. We also have a child care center in the courthouse for witnesses in cases, jurors who have jury duty, lawyers who had an emergency proceeding and couldn't make arrangements. Services like that, I think, connect with people in a way that shows we're listening. Because one of the big issues was, how do you expect me what am I going to do for my kids? And you want me to take off work and find child care? That's an economic burden on me. So we are trying to make sure that we provide that steady force of the law is equal to all, it is fair, and there's not 2 tiers of law. When we did our survey on the state of the state courts, we did a follow-up this year that was a new twist. You know, the survey is data with a professional polling company with great accuracy. We wanted to hear more, so we did focus groups. And now you talk about an eye-opening experience, because I know I had the opportunity to sit behind the double two-way glass to watch a conversation of ordinary citizens from different backgrounds talk about the courts. And, it made me feel like we have a lot of work to do to engage with the community, and so that we're at that table talking to them and they are talking directly to us about what they need to help them understand and to get the services that they need from the courts.
We started the discussion talking about the National Center for State Courts State of the State poll, and let's get back to that a little bit. It wasn't all good news. There was a 2-to-1 finding that people find the courts politicized, and the number was pushed, it seems, a lot by young people and females. So what do we do about that?
People felt like if you were rich and had a lawyer that you got better justice. And then there was also a racial component. African Americans, people of color, felt that if you were a person of color, that you didn't get the same justice. So there were those two themes that were cross-cutting, and it was very concerning because we want to make sure that everybody feels they get the same justice.
And I think, one of the important things is starting out is to listen to that information. I mean, it's easy, as we all know, sometimes just to be the judge and sit back and not be engaged in the community, I don't want to. And it's all well-intended because as judges, we want to shield ourselves from something that might create bias in our minds in a case. So we're not sometimes out in the community or around our states. But I think we've learned that we have to be, because I think we need to be talking more about what we do in the courts and how we can help folks who need help with the courts, whether it's the kind of eviction programs or whether it's the kiosks at Dollar General, which is amazing work in Indiana, and all kinds of other really interesting innovations. We can't just sit in our chambers anymore and let folks have a perception of what we're doing. We need to, I think, my view only, 1 of 5, as you learn on an appellate court, and your opinion is just one vote. We need to be out there creating more information about what we're doing. Not just civics education. Civics education is vitally important. Folks need to understand where we learn in these focus groups. It is humbling when folks really don't know the difference between state and federal courts. They don't distinguish between what the three of us do in our state's highest courts with the work of this Supreme Court of the United States. So we have to build on that civics education by letting folks know what we are doing and how we're doing it and how we can help them.
And it sounds like we need to go beyond sort of the traditional avenues of communicating, because people are not getting their news the same way that they always did. There is definitely and the polling shows that the older you are, the more likely you are to watch the traditional sources that I think of as local news or newspaper. But if you're younger, it may all be online, right? And so we need to be looking at other methods of communication, but also I hear you've all mentioned the word community. We need to be reaching out to different communities, right, than what we currently do. It's not just a trip to the Rotary anymore or the Elks Lodge. It needs to be other groups as well.
One positive that we heard consistently was jury service. People who served on a jury actually had more favorable comments based on the focus groups, and they were surprised to learn how things worked in the actual courtroom. And if you think about the number of people that we call for jury service every day in criminal and civil and family cases, there's an opportunity there. While they're at the court waiting for their trial or waiting for their case to be called, to engage with the jurors. And maybe we could do more there. But Twitter, our court has a Twitter feed. I don't know exactly how to use it. We have Facebook, and we have intranet and an internet. So we're trying different things, but we've got to get creative. I have Instagram. I only have one follower. That's my son. So I don't know that my Instagram account would influence anything, but we do have community leaders that have a lot of followers. And if we can tap those resources, that would be a great way to expand how we communicate.
What communities would you say are most underserved in terms of getting the word out there, civics education out currently?
I mean, I think it's driven largely just by low education levels, folks who naturally don't learn as much about what's going on in the state of West Virginia, for example. The rural counties, the impoverished counties, folks whose biggest problem, frankly, is waking up and figuring out whether they're going to find their drugs or whether they're, they're just not thinking similarly to those of us who are sitting on benches in robes. And so we have to go, I think, as Chief Justice Russ was saying, we have to learn to communicate in those different communities and at those different levels, meeting them where they are, not where we think they ought to be. Again, civics education, vitally important. Students should understand how all three branches of government operate, but there's got to be more customer service orientation. And that's not a phrase we use in the courts very much, and it makes folks nervous that, well, they're not our customers, they're the litigants. But we are serving them, and we're charged by our constitutions to serve them. And so we need to figure it out. I don't know, Loretta, you want to expand on that? Because you're really engaged on this topic.
Well, I think that a lot of the people that use the court have a better understanding of the courts, and that's actually the survey showed that than the people that didn't use the court. A lot of people that weren't there frequent. So it might be people that find themselves in court have a better understanding. But I think that when you look at all the millions of people in everybody's state that go into the court system, you start there. That's 101, how you treat them. If somebody speaks a different language, you have an interpreter for them. You make the courthouses user-friendly. If you can have some type of kiosk or informational information when you walk in the door. And then the procedural fairness that'll come from the hearing. Because one of the things that we found out, people care as much about how they're treated than how their end result is going to be. And you can break down a lot of barriers by treating people fairly. So everybody knows somebody that's gone to court, right? So people that have distrust in the court system heard so-and-so got screwed over by that, just who the judge knew or that. But, one person of the millions, we have 30,000 trial court judges in the United States. And each of them and their staff are they're the front lines with regard to people that you're going to trust. You're going to walk in your room thinking it's all stacked against me. So I think we start there with our judges. And then with their treatment and procedurally making sure everybody gets heard before they leave that door. And then you start working within your greater community. You've got to go know your county council and commission members, right? You ought to know who your local leaders are. You've got to work with your legislative branch because a lot of these changes have to come about legislatively. So how do you start building those relationships to go from there? We're all seeking pockets of money right now to pay for things like family recovery courts. So you've got to be able to get out. And I always tell my judges, you got to get out from behind your bench and have are you involved with food pantries? Do you know who your homeless shelters are? If you're going to be ordering services for underserved, vulnerable populations, you've got to know what's out there in your community. So I think the trust comes, I think the best way we can do it is one case, one person before us at a time, and to better meet their needs, because then they're going to tell 3 other people, I had an unbelievable experience. But we're always going to have people who aren't going to like courts because half of everybody, we solve disputes, and half the people going out the door are not going to be happy. Just treat them well. Just treat them well while they're in there.
I was recently at a recovery court luncheon fundraiser, and I found myself during the course of that thinking, I wish more people could come to these. I know it was a fundraiser because they're always looking for funds to run the recovery court, but people needed to know, I felt like, it wasn't just about dispensing justice. It was getting people to services and the good work that those problem-solving courts were doing in Tennessee. And it's like, man, this is really flying under the radar. The participants of the recovery court were standing up and talking about their experience and what they were doing now. And I'm thinking, wow, that message really does not fly very far beyond this hotel ballroom.
I think the judges, we have 151 problem-solving courts in Indiana, and they're growing fast. Big push on veterans courts as well. So we encourage our judges to invite their community members, bring them into the court, and it's been a very powerful way. Things like Adoption Day, where you let cameras in the courtroom come in and take pictures of that. We were just talking to the Michigan Chief Justice, and she was talking about today, Reunification Day, really to open up the courts. And they actually opened up the Michigan Supreme Court room to these days where 100 people per family would come in for they finally met the finish line and they could be able to get their child safely reunited with them. When I changed the rule that cameras could come in the courtroom, people were like, no, it's like, yes, because I think that's one way of doing it. Now, I think the press doesn't always, they get a little bored because some of it's like paint drying and not every case is just a big old bang up case. But I think the more transparent we are And the more we invite people to see, like, it's baby courts in Tennessee, they've got a fantastic program in that they see just the humanity that comes before and the services. And I think that will help increase trust.
Even on the criminal side, we've talked a lot about the really important problem-solving courts, but on the criminal side, where you're dealing with violent crimes and you're trying a case and you have communities that want drug dealers, violent criminal offenders to be off the streets, out of their neighborhood, and you also have victims of the crime. So how do you portray the thoughts and the considerations that go into the minds of the judge in sentencing? How do you communicate out that these are the things that I took into account when I sentenced this person, so that the public sees, and this goes to Chief Justice Rush's transparency part, that everybody's not always going to be happy with, sometimes they think the judge was too lenient, sometimes they think the judge was too strict, but if you explain, these are the things I had to consider, this is why I made that decision, even on the criminal justice side, where it's hard to have the sort of warm, fuzzy feeling all the time, because often it's been a violent offense and a violent offender. We still have to treat that criminal defendant, their family, and especially the victim of the crime's family with dignity and respect, and show that we're thoughtful, we're human, and we care about what happens in this instance.
I was always struck by the fact that there's a duty of candor for attorneys in the Code of Professional Conduct. There's no duty of candor in the judicial conduct, but really there is. If you want to get respect for your decision-making, you've got to show your work, right?
And, to your point about your great experience at the luncheon and hearing the stories of folks, we're judges, again, sort of a default setting. We're very respectful of the confidentiality of the folks that come before us. And, that's one of the things we need to guard. But what we have found in taking stories of our treatment courts and telling those stories in snippets on our court's Instagram and Facebook, those are the most popular posts we make. Folks want to hear hopeful stories, ways that a lot of what we do is hard, but we do have these occasional bright moments, whether they be adoptions or reunifications or folks coming out of and into recovery and into employment and, changing their lives. We have great stories to tell, and we need to tell them when we can.
I wanted to spend a little more time going back to the survey again, and one of the topics that also was of interest to me was about access to justice and the concern about whether or not it's an equal justice. And Chief Judge Blackburne-Rigsby, you talked about a little bit about that and about there being a gap there. How do we begin to start addressing that perception from the public?
Well, a couple of things. There is, when we talk about this justice gap, a lot of times we're talking about the civil side where, on the criminal side, if you need an attorney, one will be appointed for you in a criminal case. On the civil side, where you might be facing loss of your home, losing custody of your children, so many people need legal assistance and can't afford it. And so we're doing lots of different things in D.C. where the private bar does a lot of pro bono or legal work that they don't charge for to help. We have kiosks like Chief Justice Rush mentioned. We have the proximity of pop-up courtrooms and places people can go for hearings where they don't have to travel so far. So we're doing a lot in that realm. On the part about the fairness and this tiered system of justice, that's where we've got to do more work because, first of all, it's hard for judges to hear that people that come before them don't think they're being fair, because that's what we're supposed to be, after all, fair and impartial. And we've done some work through the National Center for State Courts recently of examining our courts' practices. Lots of state courts did this, most notably in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, where Conference of Chief Justices unanimously, that means all 50 states, District of Columbia, the chiefs passed a resolution around more efforts to ensure racial fairness in our court proceedings. Now, does that mean that the proceedings weren't fair intentionally? Of course not. But some things that we thought were well-intentioned ended up having the opposite impact. And when you stop and you look, now, wait a minute, we're setting all family custody cases at 9 a.m. And moms, low-income working parents, often people of color in the District of Columbia, it's a hardship for them to come. Same with landlord-tenant court. Are they perceiving that it's unfair because of race or ethnicity? Language access. If you don't understand what's being said, and we have sign language interpreters and more and more different language interpreters to make the process fair. So first it was acknowledging, and then many of our judges have done what we used to call implicit bias training, that we all have some personal biases. Sometimes we're not even aware of them, and it's not necessarily because of race or income. It's just, and is, as my grandma used to say. But if we train ourselves to be aware that we don't want to act on those instant gut react. We want to think about what the facts are. Are we being fair? Are we relying on an ill-informed perception? That kind of training of judges, looking at the court practices, and talking to the bar. As Chief Justice Rush said, convening public defenders and the legal aid lawyers, they want their clients to get better service, and so they want to work with the courts. So those are some examples of things, but there's more work to be done in that area.
I think your point about calling on the bar for assistance is a really great one. We haven't talked about it. You mentioned, of course, the rules of professional conduct that apply to lawyers. But a lot of the perceptions about our court system are formed by the lawyers who are telling their clients what's going on. And we need them as partners. Of course, their primary responsibilities to their clients and to be zealous advocates. But what we learned, we sat down in West Virginia and did a survey of our lawyers and also our court staff this past year in putting together a strategic plan. And then we held focus groups with some of those legal lawyer advocate groups to learn a little bit more about how they perceive our court system. And we learned that our lawyers felt like some of the trial courts were much more political than we would have liked to hear them say. And so, we need to work with the lawyers and figure out appropriately, observing all of the correct protocols and how we can work together to help improve public perception.
Feedback needs to be a two-way street. If we invite comments, you've got to respond and make some changes or say why changes are possible. That's for certain. We're not going to get any more feedback if we don't do that. What about in Indiana, access to justice?
Yeah, that's never been worse. I think it's never been worse everywhere. Sort of the middle class is not able to afford lawyers for a lot of their actions. So we have to seek, as Chief Justice, part of our role. I went every year to the legislature and asked for more money for civil legal aid. I finally was able to double the budget. I have advocated for legal services in federal money, but there's never enough. Like, we have mandatory pro bono reporting. You don't have to do it, but I can at least get a picture of how many hours. There's not enough hours to go through. So I think one of the things we're started a new Committee on Legal Education and Admission Reform. Do we license paralegals so they're able to help? Do we look at limited licenses? We've got to learn a different way to deliver legal help that maybe is not always tied to a JD to help this access. Can somebody be a paralegal and help you with child support? Can somebody help you with your housing needs? So we're not doing well. We have more and more unrepresented litigants coming to court, and it's hard on the judges too when you've got both sides unrepresented. And are you really bringing all the issues through to get the best result that you're able to? So as a profession, I think we're doing it at the Conference of Chief Justices. We're also doing it in Indiana. We have our own parallel group looking at this, breaking down some of the barriers to getting people to represent. So I think you're going to see a lot of things in the next 5 to 10 years that would not be the delivery of legal services that were not how they were traditionally delivered. So we can accommodate a wider range of people with unmet civil legal aid needs.
And to just sort of tie that back into our topic, the concern obviously is that if people feel like there is a justice system for people that can afford lawyers and getting certain results, and one that doesn't function quite as well for those that can't afford lawyers, you're not going to have trust and confidence in that system. And it sounds like that is sort of a universal issue in all your courts.
Look at the default rate. So you don't go to court. You don't trust a court. You get the summons in the mail. I went and sat and took my whole court on a day. Let's pick a day, just show up in an eviction court. Showed up in an eviction court, 250 cases set.
The entire Supreme Court?
No, I invited whoever. I got the ones that wanted to come.
Okay.
So I had a group. Not everybody likes to have field trips as much as I do. So we had a group, and I sat through an eviction day. I came unannounced. 250 cases. Not one of those people had an attorney representing them. And then a large percentage were just defaulted. They didn't show. So what do we need? Well, one, we need mediators. We need to have people there. We also need navigators, people that can help people that are going to be homeless. There's no trauma that's harder on some family that's all of a sudden on the streets with nowhere to go. How do you link them to social services? So we've sort of worked, and we've gotten some grants from the National Center with regard to having navigators be in that, because I was appalled that day. But I think as leadership within the judiciary, you got to get out. You got to go sit in those courtrooms and see. I was like, and I wanted to say warranty of habitability. You shouldn't have to pay. I remembered all my law school landlord-tenant stuff. Give me the case. So anyway, it really was very informative for me with regard to putting my budget together and I pop in, like when I travel the state, I pop in, and judges sometimes don't like it because they think I'm down or checking on them. I'm just watching, trying to not get so far removed from what the needs are. But it never would have dawned on me that 250 evictions in one morning and not one of them represented by an attorney. It was appalling that this is a system that I'm responsible for as Chief Justice.
We had a similar challenge like that in the District of Columbia. And when you add to that, like you said, we have the third largest number of attorneys of any state in the country in the District of Columbia. But we would have 95% of tenants in landlord-tenant court facing eviction appearing without counsel. And so now we looked at ways to segment the case. So usually an attorney takes on the representation of a client. They represent that client for all of their landlord-tenant case. We made it so you could have an attorney for the critical parts of the proceeding. The day you're in court and supposed to assert a defense, you talk to a lawyer who's there on the premises who could help you articulate it. And that lawyer, they serve for that moment, and then they can move out of the case if they can't take on the whole representation. But it's better than having so many people show up who may have valid defenses and not be able to assert them. So the kiosks we have just started a task force in the District of Columbia looking at alternatives. Can you have other types of professionals take pieces of different cases? Probate, where you typically have lots of documents. People come in with grandma's will and all these old papers. And if they just had a talented paralegal or trained professional who could help them organize their papers and understand what they mean, that would be a tremendous help. Right now, you can't do that, really, unless you have a legal license.
Well, you've got to have bar associations on board with this because they have to see the chiefs here.
Well, I would say our bar association in the District of Columbia is very supportive of this, which is surprising. And they really partnered with the court and wanted to push us to do this kind of task force to look at some changes we can make. So we're excited. We'll see what happens.
The one thing that occurred to me, and I was jealous there for a minute, Anna, because you were talking about all these lawyers in the district. And one issue that we've been talking about at the Conference of Chief Justices in a lot of states are those of us, again, rural counties, places in states where, in West Virginia, there's a few counties where there are 4 lawyers. One is the judge, one is the prosecutor, and, you have the other 2 to do the rest of the work. Yeah. So we take pride in our ability to regulate the practice of law and make sure that the lawyers who are representing people are doing it ethically and appropriately and competently. But there's got to be something else because we just can't serve everybody if we're going to continue to have counties in some states where there are no lawyers at all. And how can you provide services to those people or get those people access to justice, to come back around to your question, when there's no one to advise them?
Yeah, our challenge was trying to get the bar, because we have a lot of the lawyers have a national practice or international practice, trying to show them that right in our local courts, there's such a huge need. And we've had, there's a strong pro bono culture and desire for lawyers to do pro bono hours, but sometimes even that is not enough.
So our time is running out here. Before I let you go, you don't get an intermediate appellate judge that has like chiefs right in front of them here. So let me ask you this question. If we gathered again a year from now and we're looking at this National Center for State Court survey, what's your prediction? Are we going to see an upward trend in public trust and confidence in the courts? Is it going to be the same, or is it going to have a decline?
This is an interesting year for anyone that works in government. I'd be happy to hold steady this next year.
I think it's going to be slow and incremental climb because as you've heard us all say, there's still the work to be done on the ground. It didn't plummet overnight, although we did see dips in the last few years. So it's going to take some work to get it back to where we'd like to see it. But I think all the things you've heard us talk about are certainly helping. I think they're helping, and we just got to continue. Can't give up because, justice, I think, is the cornerstone of our democracy, and people feeling that they are listened to and heard is what makes our courts a place where you can peacefully resolve disputes. And our court system, if you've seen different courts around the world, our court systems are not perfect, but they're the best that I've seen, and we just have to keep working hard to keep them where they need to be to do the best work to serve the communities.
And going back to your comment about being slow to change in the judiciary, I don't think this is something we can change quickly. So I'm with Loretta that I'd be happy with stability. But if you ask me in 5 years, where will that survey be? I'm really optimistic, in part because of the amazing leadership of Chief Judge Blackburn-Rigsby, of Chief Justice Rush, and others in the Conference of Chief Justices. And they've made it their mission to really try to figure this out. And you've heard it in their answers today. They're passionate. They care. They're not the only ones. These are just 3 states and of all who are here and talking in sessions during breaks on how to solve this problem. So 5 years from now, I'm gonna say things are gonna look much better.
Well, Chief Justice Rush, Chief Justice Walker, Chief Judge Anna Blackburne-Rigsby, thank you so much for your time. I know you're all very busy and lots of things going on at the conference here in Nashville, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great job.
Yes.